Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Schneerson of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Welcome back to our special series on prayer in honor of Elul, leading up to Tishrei with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. This time that prayer is a really big part of our focus as Jews. There's a lot of prayers coming up in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And one of the things that we've been talking about, this series, as I've mentioned, is based on the Tractate Kuntres Hatefilla of the Rebbe Rashab, the Tractate on Prayer of the Rebbe Rashab. And one of the main points that the Rebbe Rashab really wants to bring home is that the great power of prayer, and in fact, perhaps we could say the whole purpose, the ultimate purpose of prayer, is the transformation of the self. Which is, again, very much related to Elul, because we know that this time of Elul is all about self-reflection and kind of going over the past previous year and trying to improve ourselves and do tshuva, to come closer to God, come closer to our true self. So what a great time to really work on improving our prayer and deepening our prayer. And in fact, today's episode, which is where we're going to be delving into chapter 8, is where we're really going to start to look at this topic specifically of how prayer actually can be used as a tool to transform the self and how that is the ultimate purpose of prayer. So up until now, some of the thoughts that we've gathered, some of the ideas that we've gathered is that in order to pray effectively and properly, we need to infuse a certain type of meditation into our prayer, both before our prayers and while we're praying as well. This type of meditation we've termed, or rather Chassidus has termed hitbonenut, which comes from the root of bina, which means is often translated to mean understanding or analysis, inquisitiveness kind of. So there's a sort of intellectual meditation going on. But we've also discussed how really the goal of this type of meditation is actually to achieve a certain place of da'as, which is the third intellectual attribute of the mind, which is associated as being the feeling aspects of the mind. It's the connector between the intellect and the emotions. And it's the source of all of our feelings. And this concept of das, we had a whole episode where we really talked about das and we really defined what it was and everything. We're going to bring it back today because today's episode, as I mentioned, is where we're really going to talk about the transformative power of prayer and how prayer can and should be used for transformation. And we're going to again discuss how it is our das specifically that allows us to do this. So let's get straight into the text and we'll discuss more as we go. So the Rebbe Rashab begins, and he says that there are many people who study Chassidus, and they study it correctly, and they have a good sensitivity towards Chassidus, like, that they're really, like good students of Chassidus, and they're learning it correctly. It's not like there's anything wrong with their learning, but nevertheless, they kind of minimize their prayer, and they neglect exerting themselves during prayer. Like they kind of focus on learning, and they don't really focus so much on prayer. And it's not that they don't pray. So these people do pray. They pray just like everybody else prays, like just, the standard way that we're supposed to pray, 3 prayers a day, and they do all the prayers. And even sometimes, they do experience certain emotions during their prayer, but these emotions, these feelings that they have in their heart, is just come from a kind of more general hitbonenut, more general meditation, and in a more like shortened manner, like we've spoken about above. We've spoken about these people who study Chassidus and they kind of get the idea, they get the main point of the idea, and they're like, oh, okay, great, and maybe they even get excited about it, and it arouses some kind of emotion in there, but they're not really exerting themselves. They're not really putting the effort into it to get to the deep place that we want to get to in our meditation and ultimately our prayers. And now the next thing the Rebbe Rashab says is pretty harsh, is he says that, this being said, these kind of people, like if they aren't really exerting themselves in their prayers properly, to the fullest extent, then their exertion in learning Chassidus is actually empty. God forbid. So why is this? How could the Rebbe Rashab say such harsh words? So he says, this is aside from the fact that the whole vitality and the whole sustenance of being involved in Torah study and being involved in mitzvahs comes from tefillah, comes from prayer, which we see in the Tanya. It's spoken about that that love and fear of God are actually the source of the 248 mitzvahs aseh, the positive commandments, and the 365 negative commandments. So basically, the motivating force behind why we do all the positive commandments is our love of God. And the motivating force why we refrain from doing the transgressions is out of our fear of God. So really, these emotive aspects are really the foundation and the vitalizing force behind, they're like the motor, the instigator behind our entire other parts of our service of God, of actually keeping the mitzvahs. And this includes learning Torah. That also, when we learn Torah, in order for our Torah learning to be correct, we need to be able to feel the vitality and the light in our learning Torah. And the way that this happens is through beginning with prayer. We need this introduction of prayer. And this is why, continues the Rebbe Rashab, prayer is actually likened to the 18 vertebrae of the spine that hold up the entire body. So this is a subject that really interests me, especially because of my work in fitness and physiology and stuff like that. So just to get into this a little bit deeper, because it's a subject that interests me. So, when we say prayer, if you look at let's say the morning prayers or the afternoon prayers, there's a lot there. We have the Birchas HaShachar that we say upon waking up in the morning. There's the Birchas HaTorah, the blessings, before that we say before learning Torah. There's Korbanos, which is where we recite and we go through the service that was given in the temple, that we did in the temple to give the sacrifices. There's Psukei de Zimra, where we say different verses of praise to God. Then we have the Shema prayer. And this all actually leads up to the main prayer, which is the Shmoneh Esrei, the Amida prayer, known as the standing prayer. And we also call it Shmoneh Esrei because it contains 18 blessings in it. There was actually a 19th that was added later on. However, really the base of this prayer is 18 blessings. And the way that this is described throughout rabbinical literature is that these 18 blessings correspond to the 18 vertebrae of the spine. So those of you who are familiar a little bit with anatomy and physiology might be saying to yourselves, wait, there are more than 18 vertebrae of the spine. So just, for those of you out there who are like me and are kind of interested in this more anatomical stuff, I'm going to actually break it down and explain where this number 18 comes from. So the way that the sages actually counted these vertebrae is that the sages only counted those vertebrae which began after the shoulders and up until the pelvis. So anything above the shoulders and anything at the pelvic area and below were now not counted in this count. So even though, yes, there are 7 cervical vertebrae, we really only start at the bottom 3 in terms of the counting. So there's that would be C5, C6, and C7. And it's described that these 3 cervical vertebrae correspond to the first 3 blessings in the Shmoneh Esrei prayer. Then we have the 12 thoracic vertebrae. This is the upper part of the spine. And those correspond to the next 12 blessings within the Shmoneh Esrei. And then we come to the lumbar spine. And the lumbar spine, even though technically it has 5 vertebrae within it, the bottom 3 vertebrae connect with the pelvic floor and are kind of considered to be somewhat connected to the pelvic area. So they're not exclusively of the spine. So we really only count 2 of the lumbar vertebrae. And those 2 lumbar vertebrae correspond to the final 2 blessings of the Shmoneh Esrei. So then we have, in total, we have the 3 cervical vertebrae, the 12 thoracic vertebrae, and then the 2 lumbar vertebrae, and that equals 18. So these 18 vertebrae hold up the entire body, and they allow us to stand up erect. These vertebrae also, this is where we have the spinal nerves that allow us to feel, that allow us to move, the sensory neurons and the motor neurons. So the spiritual correspondence to these 18 vertebrae is these 18 blessings in the Shmoneh Esrei prayer. And the Rebbe Rashab says that this is elaborated upon, this connection between the vertebrae and davening is elaborated upon in Likutei Torah in the Maimer beginning, Lo hebit aven chole, which is a verse from Bamidbar. So now the Rebbe Rashab goes on and he says that not only is it true that, having this prayer gives this vitality to the rest of the mitzvahs that we do, including our learning, but actually, even when it comes to the learning itself, the whole sustainability of the knowing and the understanding, when we understand godliness and chassidus, so that this thing will become engraved in our mind, so that like when we learn the chassidus, whatever it is that we're learning is going to become really ingrained in our minds and in our heart. How does this happen? How does this integration happen within ourselves, that our learning will become integrated into ourselves? This happens specifically during prayer. If not for prayer, if we don't have this practice of prayer properly, then whatever it is that we're learning is going to be forgotten and it's going to be lost. And it doesn't matter how much we exert ourselves in learning about these godly ideas, it's all going to be for naught, God forbid. And now to support this idea, the Rebbe Rashab brings a verse from Mishlei. This is from Mishlei chapter 17, verse 16, where it says, Lama ze mechir b'yad ksil liknot chochma v'lev ayin. Why is there a price in the fool's hand to buy wisdom when the heart is not here? So meaning to say what he's describing here is, why does the fool have a price to buy wisdom when the heart isn't there? Meaning to say that, here is a person exerting themselves with their mind and knowledge, really trying to learn and understand the things that they're learning, and they're trying to ingrain it into their minds and into their heart. But if they don't have the service of prayer, if they don't have this practice of prayer down, then whatever it is that they're learning is going to be lost after a certain amount of time. It's not going to be lasting within them. And now in brackets, the Rebbe Rashab says, and such a person inherits a double portion of Gehenom. Gehenom is commonly translated to mean purgatory. It's like this cleansing process that the soul undergoes after death. So why a double portion? It doesn't really explain it here, but perhaps it's like, on the one hand, not only is his prayer not okay, but such a person, God forbid, if their prayer isn't okay, then it means that their learning is also not up to par. Because learning in and of itself is just the idea of knowledge and understanding, but it doesn't, the essence of the godly idea does not get engraved inside of the inner and depth of his soul. So even if such a person does pray afterwards, so we're not saying this person doesn't pray, so they do pray, and they do have a kind of like a meditative state about them, like they do engage in hitbonenut, but it's in a more general kind of way, and about like kind of like the main point, like the summary of the idea, like they just kind of like, okay, they learned something, they got the point of it, and then they kind of keep it in mind while they're praying, and all the more so this is the case if they don't even keep it in mind while they're praying. Like it could be somebody who learns chassidus before they pray, and then they pray and they totally forgot about what they learned. But in either case, since it's like they're just kind of like keeping it in mind or not keeping it in mind in a more like general summation kind of way, then after a little bit of time, they're going to slowly begin to slowly begin to like forget pieces of this idea, to the point that it totally leaves them entirely and they don't remember it at all. So the only way to prevent this is when the details of these godly ideas, in every single detail of it, become engraved inside of his mind and in heart in an essential way. And the way that this happens is through the service of prayer. Because through this service of prayer causes them to become substantiated, to really establish themselves within his soul in an eternal way. The Hebrew term for this is kiyum nitzchi, which is like eternal sustainability. And this is truly the true closeness to godliness. Okay, so this is sort of like the first point that is brought up in this chapter today, is that, the importance of proper meditation is such that it really is the vitalizing force behind taking whatever learning of chassidus a person does and make it so that we don't forget our learning, and that this learning actually becomes a part of us. Now the Rebbe Rashab goes a little bit further with all of this in terms of the self-transformation, and he begins talking about this idea of the makeup of our souls and bodies, and about this idea that our souls, our godly souls, are enclosed within our bodies and within our animal soul. So, meaning to say that this godly soul that we have is clothed within an animal soul. Now, what do we know about this animal soul? So this animal soul is very very materialistic, and it's very coarse, and it has kind of like natural character traits, midos, and its natural character traits, otherwise known as midos, are very forceful. They're very assertive, and they're very strong. Okay, now the Rebbe Rashab brings this interesting parentheses where he talks about how there are many different levels of a nefesh bahamis, of an animal soul, of different types of animal souls, and there are actually 3 different general types of animal souls. What are these 3 types that are of animal souls? So they're actually different animals. So it's either an ox, a lamb, or a goat. So simply put, there are different types of people. Different people have different personality types. And these different personality types, these different kind of like natural natures that we have, these are our animalistic, our instinctual natures. They manifest, they present themselves in the form of these kind of archetypes of these kind of animals. It could be an ox, a lamb, or a goat. So now, the Rebbe Rashab is going to describe each of these a little bit. So first of all, the goat. So the Rebbe Rashab is going to talk about the goat. So he says that a goat, what is the assertiveness and the strength of a goat? Is it stands in one place and it doesn't move, and it doesn't get excited at all. So its strength and its assertiveness, its like firmness, isn't really like obvious. Like if you just see like a goat like standing in a mountain, like a mountain goat or something like that, it's not like it's going to necessarily look like really scary or really fierce. It's just kind of standing there. But when do we see its strength? When do we see like how intense it is when you touch it. If like somebody tries to kind of like push a goat or something like that, then it stands strong. It's like very stubborn. It's not going to move, and it doesn't get affected by anything. Now, an ox, on the other hand, is kind of the opposite. So an ox is called a shor negach. It's like a goring ox, that it goes and it hits, it's more violent. It's more obviously aggressive. And now, interestingly here, the Rebbe Rashab brings another parenthesis, and he says that actually an ox, somebody with a nature of, like all these things, again, are describing different people's natures. Like some people have more of a goat nature, like they're very kind of stubborn by nature. They don't go anywhere. And they're not really like moved by anything, versus an ox is much more like aggressive and assertive. And the Rebbe Rashab says that actually this type of nature of an ox, because of the fact that it is very like moving and it does move around, it's much more animated. It's actually easier to get it to move in a good way, because it has this aspect of moving in a way that it is kind of getting excited. There is some like movement going on there. And this comes because of the weakness of its ego. Anyway, interestingly enough, which is not very strong. And that's why it moves around. So the Rebbe Rashab is saying that the fact that an ox moves so much is actually an indication that its ego is not overpowering. And so it does have hope. Like there is hope that we can actually move it in a positive direction. And then finally, then we talk about the lamb. And the nature of a lamb is to be very soft. And it's kind of easy to manipulate it, and to get it to transform into something else. And there are details of this, and there are many different levels and all of this. And so, so everybody has a different nature, and we all have different things to work on and in different ways. So again, some people have the nature of more like a goat, like more of this like stubborn nature. Some are more of like an ox, like they're more like this like aggressive kind of nature. And then there's those that are more like lambs, that are more like quiet and more submissive by nature. Now, the Rebbe Rashab says that the whole purpose of the soul coming down, descending here into the body, is to clarify the animal soul and to refine the midos, these natural midos, these character traits, and to transform them into the good side, into what's known as the sitra achra, the positive side of things. And this is actually how the number of days that each person is allotted in their life, this is how it's calculated. It's in accordance with the amount of birurim that they need to do, the amount of rectifications that they need to do. As is written, and now this is a verse from Tehillim, chapter 90, verse 10, where it says, "Yemei bahem shiv'im shana." So the days of our years, because of them, are 70 years. So meaning to say that Hashem gives us a certain number of years in accordance with the amount of time we need to refine and rectify our animal souls. And just, to get even deeper into this pasuk. So again, looking at that pasuk, it says, "Yemei shnotenu bahem shivim shana." The days of our years, because of them, are 70 years. But if you look at the Hebrew, it says bahem shivim, like it says, it's translated into because of them are 70 years. But the way it reads in Hebrew is the days of our years within them are 70 years. And that word within them, bahem, actually has the same is the same root as the word behemah, which means animal. So it's alluding to the fact that this animal is found within our years, and the whole purpose of our lives is to rectify this animal within us. And the Rebbe Rashab says that this is written about more elsewhere in other places. Now, bringing back to our topic at hand, the Rebbe Rashab says that the ikar, the main refinement and rectification and the clarification, comes from the service of prayer, specifically from tefillah specifically. So the way that this works is that we actually use the tools of the animal soul itself. So the animal soul has a mind, has, our intellect, or, our IQ, so to speak. That's our animal soul. That's actually our animal soul. And so our logic, the way that we use our mind, our powers of contemplation and everything like that, that's the tools of the animal soul. So what we want to do is we want to take our godly soul and have our godly soul be activating the animal soul. And the way that this is done is through this meditation that we've been describing, through specifically lengthening in our, in really thinking about these things, using hisbonenus and hamakata dat, as we described above. So, we're using our power of bina and our power of das to really deepen into these ideas, like really think about these godly ideas in a deep way, so that we're using our animal soul, our animal mind, our animalistic mind, our physical mind, our physical logic to understand these things and really delve deeply into these things, so that it too, we're kind of schlepping the animal along so that it too will also feel the godliness within these ideas, so that the love and fear of the godly soul will get the animal soul to also experience this love and fear. So it's like we're sort of like tricking, in a way, the animal soul to, we're schlepping it along for the ride. We're using its tools, we're using its own raw material to, in a godly way, and then it becomes a vehicle for godliness, and then it too experiences the fruits of that in feeling the godliness. So this is what we described so far. This is when we're talking about things that are, logical, like when we learn chassidus and when we think about chassidus and godly ideas and everything like that. But this also applies to service that is above intellect. So what is this about? So this is when the attributes of the godly soul overcome the attributes of the animal soul and subdue the attributes of the animal soul. So when a person really gets excited with a true type of love for godliness, then this love overcomes the foreign love of the animal soul to all kinds of other kinds of pleasures and physical pleasures, so that he won't want it anymore at all. So it's like, the godly soul really dominates to the point where it overtakes the animal soul, and it's above an intellect. So it's not about using the intellectual powers of the animal soul anymore. It's something much higher. It's where we actually rise above intellect, and the godly soul overtakes the animal soul, and its pleasures and its desires overtake the animal soul, such that the animal soul doesn't even want physical things anymore and like coarse desires. It goes along for the ride of the godly soul, which really wants godliness. And the Rebbe Rashab says that this is explained further in the Tanya, in the Sefer Shel Beinonim, in the first part of Sefer Shel Beinonim, in chapter 9, where it talks about this type of love of God that burns like a firing flame in his heart, from the depths of the heart, in the right ventricle of the heart. That it's this type of love is so strong that it's actually going to spill over into the left ventricle of the heart. And that's where the element of water, the negative waters, are found there. So the left ventricle of the heart contains within it the desire for more negative things that are not godly. And the source of all of that, the source of pleasures, of negative pleasures, is the element of water. And, and there's a lot of different, like the Tanya goes into this, that like the source of every negative character trait actually comes from a different element. So here we're talking about the yearning for pleasures that are foreign, that are not about God. And that comes from the element of water. So such a person who's able to have their godly soul take over so strongly that they can actually have the desire for godliness that's originates in the right ventricles of the heart spill over into the left ventricle as well, and overpower the foreign pleasures, the desire for foreign pleasures. Now, just a little side note here. So in the Tanya, if I'm not mistaken, this process, this ability to transform our negative pleasures and have our positive pleasures overtake it, this is really the service more of a tzaddik. But the Rebbe Rashab doesn't mention that here. So maybe it's something that all of us can kind of at least get somewhat of a sense of to some extent. And now the Rebbe Rashab says that, every person knows on their own what their own negative character traits are. Like, we all have different things that we need to work on. So what we're supposed to do is, while we're praying, is we're actually supposed to focus on whatever it is that we need to work on. And then we're supposed to think about the positive, the holy counterpart to this negative character trait, and work on actually transforming it. So let's say, for example, I don't know, just something that just came to mind. It's not something the Rebbe Rashab mentioned, but let's say somebody has an issue with anger, that they get very angry a lot. So, instead of, one thing that they can maybe do is they can focus on maybe channeling that anger towards getting angry and upset and standing up for Torah and for God, and learning how to control their anger and not be angry in the moment at people that they actually love and that they shouldn't be angry at. Okay, now the Rebbe Rashab says that the main mirror, this main rectification, how does it happen? How do we actually cause this rectification to happen? This is through our very favorite trait, which is known as das, which we've spoken about. So das, this, translated as knowledge, but it really means a lot more than that. So das is kind of, there's so many different, das is like such a big topic. There's so many different ways to translate this word. It's like, connection, the feeling of the mind, things like that. Another way to talk about das is in terms of having an opinion. In modern day Hebrew, we actually say this, like, ma da'atcha al zeh, like, what is your opinion about this? So the idea of das is actually to be able to distinguish between good and bad. So the Rebbe Rashab here brings a teaching from the Gemara in Eruvim, page 19a, which says, Im en de'ah havdala minayin. If a person doesn't have das, then how can they distinguish between one thing and another? Meaning to say that the main aspect of distinguishing between good and bad comes about through das, through this trait of das. And the reason for this is actually connected to the fact that the whole idea of das is feeling, as we described before. And since this whole idea of das has to do with feeling, then this das has the potential, has the power to be able to discern between good and bad. So, if you think about it, it makes sense. It's like, if without feeling, without having a certain feeling about something, then there's kind of no opinion. Like, it's like if you learn some kind of subject in school or on your own or whatever, and you don't have any personal feelings about the particular subject, it's kind of like just very dry and abstract. Like, let's say you're learning about, some political system in some country that has nothing to do with you. You kind of like, it's just like information, but if you're learning about the politics of the city that you live in, it's very much going to affect your life, then you're going to feel something about it because you're like, oh yeah, I know that place. I know this district they're talking about. I know that school, this is very much going to affect my life. You're going to have an opinion about it because it's connected to your feelings about that place. Now, the Rebbe Rashab here is going to really show how, there really is this connection between the mind and feelings. So, we usually think about feelings as being a heart kind of thing, but really we see that it's all connected, because even in a very physical way, if a person feels a certain pain in one of their one part of their body, then where do they feel this pain? They actually, we say things like, ow, my foot hurts or whatever, but it's actually, it's not your foot that's hurting. You actually experience this pain in your brain. And this is because there's these sinews of feeling that come from the brain that go out into all of the different organs. So, again, thinking about this in a physiological state, from a physiological place, then, I think of this in terms of like the nerve endings that are found in the different parts of the body, but that connect back up to the central nervous system in the brain. And that's where we actually experience what's going on. So yes, we get impulses from our surroundings and the different parts of our body, but the place that we actually experience it is in our brain. And in line with this, then we know that the more das a person has, then the more they're going to they're going to hurt. Like a child, we see children crying, if they get hurt or something like that. They actually could withstand a lot more pain than somebody who's much older and who has more das. So I was actually talking about this with a friend of mine recently about this idea of like horror movies. Like there was this movie that I came across pretty recently that I had seen as a kid. And as a child, I watched this movie and it was like, it was a very enjoyable movie. It was really fun and entertaining. And as an adult, just watching a few minutes of the movie, I was really horrified and disturbed by it. And we were talking about how this is that, as you go through life, you actually gain more experience. And that experience translates into having like more, life like knowledge. So, the same thing that maybe as a child, it didn't really affect you so much, it's actually going to hurt a lot more. Like children by nature are a lot more resilient. They're a lot more ignorant in a good way, kind of than adults are. And the Rebbe Rashab says that this is also true for animals. So an animal also doesn't have das. So they also don't actually feel the same pain the way that a person feels pain. So, they do feel some pain, he says, because they do have this koach hamedameh, it's called, that's in the sinews of their own minds. So there are pain receptors in an animal's mind as well, but it's not as much as for a human. It's not on the same level as for a human. And so not only is this the case in terms of feeling pain, but all the more so is this the case in terms of like receiving money, or also the opposite, God forbid, like in terms of poverty. This also comes from the place of das. So a very common example that's often used is, if you take a baby and you give the baby $100 bill, they're not going to be interested in it. They might tear up the $100 bill. Like they don't understand the value of that money. If you give them like the option between like a candy or a chocolate and that $100 bill, they're most likely going to go to the chocolate, even though if they were to take the $100 bill, I mean, not really because they're a baby, but like theoretically that $100 bill could buy them a lot more chocolate, but they don't have that understanding. They don't have that das, so they don't understand the value of money. And so to poverty, we've spoken about this before, that a lot of kids who grew up really poor actually did. I mentioned, a teacher of mine who grew up in a trailer park, and he didn't actually know that he was poor growing up. It was a normal kind of thing, but I'm sure that his parents knew that they were poor. Like kids don't have that same understanding as adults do. So, this is true in terms of pain. This is true in terms of money, both, having money and not having money. And this is also true actually in terms of like cruelty and compassion, that both of these traits, whether we're talking about cruelty and compassion, it's not just about the understanding of the mind, but there has to be a level of das in there. So meaning to say that like you could have a person who, knows about another person who's very poor, who doesn't have a lot of money, and they understand it. They understand all the details. Yes, this person's starving. They have barely any food to put on the table or anything like that. But if they don't have the feeling towards it, if they don't have the level of das, so they have the understanding, but they don't have the das, they're not going to feel compassion towards this person. And when they do have this feeling, then they are going to feel that compassion towards them. So it's not about like understanding so much as it is about das, as about like really knowing, And so too is this a case about getting excited about something good. So, people, like I've given the example before in other episodes about the idea of musical appreciation or wine appreciation or any kind of appreciation. Like when you have these connoisseurs, the more a person knows about a certain subject, and when I say know, I don't mean, again, just on an intellectual level, but actually really knows it in an experiential way, the more they're going to appreciate it. And so in conclusion, the final line here is that the Rebbe Rashab tells us that this ability that we have to discern between good and to push aside evil, this comes from the feeling of das specifically. So that's our chapter. And now in summation, the summary here given by the Frierdiker Rebbe is that in this chapter, we've clarified how a prayer leads to, first of all, bringing vitality into our understanding. So again, a person can learn a lot of even chassidus and godly ideas and everything like that. But if they don't take the time to really develop their practice of praying, then they're going to be missing the vitality in their learning. There's going to be something lacking in their learning. It's not going to be as sustainable. It's not going to become immersed within themselves to the same extent. And we specifically spoke about this idea of the refining of the animal soul, which is our ultimate purpose here in the world. And we talked about how the animal soul, there's different types of animal souls. And in general, it could be divided up into 3 different categories. We spoke about the category of the goat, which is very stubborn, the category of the ox, which is very fierce and, moves around a lot. And then there's the category of the lamb, which is very quiet and submissive. And for each one of these things, then a person, whatever their nature is, we need to work on refining ourselves. We need to work on rectifying our animal nature. And the way that we do this is specifically through cultivating our das. Through the das is this force that we have that gives us this ability to discern between good and bad. So that's the end of today's chapter, and we will continue along these lines next time. So we're starting to get a little bit deeper into the actual, practical aspect of praying and how we can use prayer to refine ourselves, transform ourselves, and ultimately to connect with God. So hope you're enjoying, and I will speak with you next time. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.